At the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., the giant pandas are likely still crunching on bamboo, the lions are lounging, and the elephants are going about their day. But if you tried to watch them, you'd just see a blank screen. The zoo's beloved live webcams have all been shut down. This isn't a technical glitch. It's because the federal employees who run them have been deemed non-essential and sent home without pay. This one small, almost absurd consequence of the U.S. government shutdown is the perfect illustration of a much larger chaos that's about to ripple across the country. Because if the person running the Panda Cam is non-essential, it raises a far more serious question. Who else has been sent home, and what happens when they're not there to do their jobs?
That image, the Panda Cam going dark, it's a really potent symbol, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows just how fast things we take for granted can stop when the political gears grind to a halt over the budget. We're talking about a failure to pass the basic funding bills, the appropriations. And when that money stops flowing, large parts of the federal government just switch off.
Right. So that's what we're diving into today, the mechanics, but really the consequences, the real-world fallout when this political stalemate happens between Congress, affecting both parties, and basically forces the government into this shutdown mode. What's the scale we're talking about here immediately?
Immediately, you're looking at a huge disruption. About 40% of the federal workforce is directly impacted. That's, around 800,000 people?
800,000, that's a massive number.
It is. And they're either furloughed, sent home without pay, or they're told they have to work, but with no idea when they'll actually get paid. So for this deep dive, we really need to unpack the costs that go way beyond just the missed paychecks. We're looking at three big areas of chaos. First, the direct human toll, the financial hit on the workers themselves. Second, the vulnerabilities that suddenly pop up in things like public safety and health services. And third, this unfolding crisis, often with permanent damage in our national parks.
Okay, let's start with that human cost. It feels like the most immediate, the most personal angle on this whole thing. You mentioned that split essential workers who have to show up and the furloughed ones sent home. Talk about the essentials first, the ones working without pay.
Right, the accepted or essential folks. It's a critical group. Think TSA screeners at the airport, air traffic controllers, a lot of Border Patrol agents, certain hospital staff. Their jobs are considered vital for safety, security, protecting life and property. So they have to report to work. The services can't stop. But, and this is the kicker, their paychecks stop indefinitely. They're doing incredibly high-stress jobs under this immense personal financial strain.
And that stress, that uncertainty, it doesn't just affect them, right? It becomes a risk for all of us using those services. If the people keeping us safe are worried about paying their rent, doesn't that create a problem?
That's the crucial link, exactly. Think about an air traffic controller. Let's call him Michael, based on accounts from past shutdowns. He's in that control tower. Intense concentration, guiding planes, thousands of lives, depending on his decisions every hour.
Yeah.
But in the back of his mind, there's this constant worry, this gnawing uncertainty, as some have described it. The mortgage payment is due next week, the car payment. How does that not affect performance?
Yeah, I can't imagine. That sounds like a huge cognitive load on top of an already demanding job. How does that uncertainty play out in a system like air travel where you need near perfection?
Well, it introduces failure points into the system. That stress, it doesn't just stay at home. It comes to work. It can erode focus, impact decision-making. The financial stability of Michael and his colleagues is directly tied to the safety of air travel. And we saw this happen very clearly during the 2018-2019 shutdown.
What happened then?
Because of that financial pressure, essential workers like air traffic controllers started calling in sick in large numbers. Maybe they couldn't focus. Maybe they literally couldn't afford the gas to get to work. The result? Significant cascading delays at major airports across the U.S. because staffing dropped below minimum safe levels. That's when a political budget fight becomes a genuine public safety issue.
That's terrifying, actually. Okay, so that's the essential group. What about the others, the furloughed employees, the ones deemed non-essential? They do get back pay eventually, right? Congress passed a law for that.
Yes, since 2019, back pay is legally guaranteed. But that doesn't mean the short-term shock isn't brutal. It's definitely not a paid vacation.
Right. And
the data on their financial situation is pretty stark. Now, federal workers, generally speaking, are maybe a little better prepared than the average American. About 61% say they have at least $1,000 in emergency savings.
That sounds okay, right?
$1,000? It's something. It's something. But during the last big shutdown, the 35-day one, that cushion just wasn't enough. Get this. 62% of federal workers surveyed said they burned through all or most of their emergency savings.
Wait, 62%, the majority, wiped out their savings in just over a month. That's not just an inconvenience, that's hitting bedrock.
Exactly. It undermines their whole financial foundation. And the immediate signs of strain were really alarming. You had 83% reporting more stress, and fully half said they were much more stressed.
I believe it. How did that stress translate into actual financial problems, like missing bills?
Oh, absolutely. Nearly half, 49%, fell behind on regular bills, utilities, car payments, student loans, you name it. And even more seriously, 27% missed a mortgage or rent payment.
Missing housing payments, that's huge. That impacts credit scores, potentially even leads to eviction risk down the line. What else are people forced to do to get by?
Well, the coping mechanisms really start to damage their future financial health. 42% took on new debt. Think high-interest credit cards, probably, just to buy groceries or gas.
Okay.
40% had to borrow money from family or friends, which, puts strain on those relationships too.
Yeah.
But maybe the most damaging thing, 26%, over a quarter, had to borrow or withdraw money from their retirement savings.
Oof. Raiding the retirement fund just to survive a temporary shutdown?
Yeah.
That has long-term consequences, penalties, lost growth. You don't easily recover from that. It's like they're being penalized for the government's failure.
That's exactly it. And in the really tough cases, you had 25%, 1 in 4, reporting they had to use food banks. These are employed people, often with decent jobs, turning to food banks. It shows how quickly stability can evaporate. This whole picture really underscores the long-term economic ripple effects, not just on the individuals, but on the whole system.
And there's another group we haven't even mentioned yet, the contractors. They work alongside federal employees, but they're not technically on the government payroll.
Right. They are absolutely the forgotten workforce in all of this. Yeah. When an agency shuts down, the contractors working there doing everything from IT support and maintenance to cleaning and cafeteria services, they lose their jobs immediately.
And no back pay for them.
None. Because they aren't direct federal employees, the law guaranteeing back pay doesn't cover them. So they face the exact same financial shock, that sudden loss of income, but with zero guarantee they'll ever recoup those lost wages. They just absorb the full cost of the political fight. So you have this immense strain on the individuals, the workers, and the contractors. But that strain immediately radiates outwards, right? It starts to degrade the actual services we all rely on. That's the second layer of chaos, the erosion of public health and safety functions.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you shut down places like the NIH or the CDC, research just stops. But it sounds like it's worse than just hitting pause. You can't just shelve biological experiments for weeks and expect them to be fine, can you?
No, you absolutely cannot hit pause on biology or chemistry or long-running studies. Take the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. It's the bedrock of biomedical research for the country. I read this really painful account illustrating this. Let's call her Lena. She was a postdoctoral researcher there working on a critical project tracking a novel flu virus. This was a multi-year study, highly sensitive, using cell cultures that needed daily attention, precise timing.
Okay, crucial work for, pandemic preparedness. So what happened when the shutdown hit?
She was deemed non-essential, furloughed. The lab doors were locked. Without her there every day doing the maintenance, the feeding, the monitoring, those sensitive cell lines just died.
Oh, no.
The entire experiment, 18 months of work, resources, data, completely lost, just gone. A vital piece of understanding how a new flu virus might behave, potentially jump to humans, wiped out. She had to start all over again.
That's devastating. A direct hit to our ability to prepare for health threats. And it's not just lab work, right? What about clinical trials with actual patients?
Exactly. NIH runs crucial clinical trials, often for patients with rare or complex conditions who might not have other options. During a shutdown, enrollment freezes. New patients can't start treatment. For some people, that delay could be the difference between getting a potentially life-saving therapy or not. Hundreds of people can be affected. It's a real setback for medical progress and patient care, highlighting these critical vulnerabilities in our public health system.
Okay, so medical research takes a hit. What about something more immediate, like the safety of the food we buy every day?
That system gets compromised pretty quickly, too. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has to halt its routine inspections of food manufacturing and processing plants. They might do emergency inspections if something really bad happens, but the proactive preventative checks, those stop.
So less oversight on food production.
Right. And they also pause updates to something called the Core Investigation Table. That's basically a public dashboard summarizing ongoing investigations into foodborne illness outbreaks across the country. So the early warning system kind of goes dark.
And this is happening when the system might already be under stress. It's not like these agencies are always flush with resources to begin with, right?
That's a really important point. This shutdown vulnerability doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's often layered on top of existing weaknesses. For instance, earlier in the year this happened, there had already been significant funding cuts. About $11.4 billion in CDC funding for state public health work was actually pulled back.
Pulled back. What did that force the CDC to do?
Well, it forced them to quietly scale back a key program called FoodNet, the Foodborne Diseases Active Surveillance Network.
Scale back how? What did they stop watching?
They had to tell their state partners to stop tracking several really important foodborne pathogens. Listeria, Vibrio, 5 other things can cause serious illness. They had to narrow their focus mainly to just Salmonella and E. coli.
Listeria can be really dangerous, right? Especially for certain groups.
Extremely dangerous. It's less common than Salmonella, but the mortality rate is much higher, like up to 20%. So you combine these prior funding cuts, meaning we're already tracking fewer dangerous pathogens, with a shutdown that halts inspections and pauses outbreak reporting. You create a massive blind spot.
So we're less able to spot and track food safety risks, potentially until they blow up into a major outbreak.
That's the risk. Consumers are potentially left unaware of hazards that are building up in the system.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. What about basic social safety nets? We assume things like Social Security checks keep going out, but what about programs for really vulnerable groups like WIC?
Yeah, the core entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, they generally continue because they have dedicated funding streams. But even then, staff furloughs can cause processing delays and service disruptions. But the programs funded through annual appropriations are hit hardest and fastest. WIC, the Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children, is extremely vulnerable. It provides very specific, vital nutritional support for low-income pregnant women, new mothers, infants, and young kids.
And why does WIC run out of money faster than, say, food stamps?
It operates on a different, shorter funding cycle than SNAP, the main food stamp program. Sure. SNAP usually has funds to last maybe a month or so into a shutdown, though even that creates huge anxiety. But WIC, it can run out of funds very quickly, sometimes within just a couple of weeks.
So millions of moms and babies could lose access to formula, healthy food, counseling, just like that.
Just like that. It's an immediate crisis for those families. SNAP faces its own funding cliff if a shutdown drags on, creating massive uncertainty for tens of millions relying on it.
And what about infrastructure stuff? Not roads and bridges collapsing, maybe, but things that grease the wheels of the economy, like the housing market.
Right. A key example is the National Flood Insurance Program, run by FEMA. It gets suspended immediately in a shutdown.
So if you're trying to buy a house in a flood zone and need that insurance to get your mortgage,
you're stuck. The deal can't close. Millions of properties require this insurance, so suspending the program gums up the housing market and delays countless transactions that rely on these government services.
Okay, let's turn to maybe the most visible symbol when the government shuts down, the national parks. They always seem to become these political footballs, right? Sparking debates about access versus protection.
They absolutely do. The parks are where the public most directly sees the impact of the government just stopping. And interestingly, we've seen two totally different approaches to managing them during shutdowns. And, well, neither one worked out particularly well.
Okay, what was the first approach?
Back in 2013, that was the total closure model. Under the Obama administration, the decision was made to lock the gates, barricade everything. The argument from the NPS director at the time, John Jarvis, was basically that with almost all staff furloughed, closure was the only way to protect the parks, the resources, the visitors from damage, vandalism, accidents.
But that caused a huge backlash, didn't it? The images of locked memorials.
Oh, enormous political fallout.
Right.
It became this potent symbol of government dysfunction. You had those images of veterans physically breaking through barricades at the WWII Memorial in D.C., which was politically explosive. Plus, there's a huge economic cost. That 16-day shutdown in 2013, it cost local communities around the parks an estimated $414 million in lost tourism spending. Closing them was politically painful and economically damaging.
So fast forward to the 2018-2019 shutdown, and the approach changed.
Completely. The Trump administration went for the open with skeleton crew model. The goal here seemed to be explicitly political. Avoid the bad optics of closed parks, deny critics that visual symbol of shutdown failure. So they kept many parks technically open roads, maybe some basic access, but with almost no staff. Sometimes just a handful of essential personnel, sometimes practically none. And they tried to use park entrance fees to pay for minimal operations like trash pickup, which the Government Accountability Office later said likely violated federal appropriations law.
Okay, so the park stayed open, which maybe looked better politically, but keeping vast natural areas open with no one really in charge sounds like a recipe for disaster environmental.
It was an environmental catastrophe, far worse in many ways than the closure model. When you have millions of acres of forests, deserts, coastlines open, but no rangers to enforce rules, no staff to manage waste, no one monitoring resources, chaos is inevitable.
What kind of chaos are we talking?
We saw reports of widespread illegal off-roading, people driving vehicles into sensitive habitats, causing damage that could take decades, even centuries, to heal. There was significant vandalism, graffiti on rock formations, people damaging historical sites. And the trash and human waste situation, it became a public health hazard in some places.
Can you give some examples of that?
Sure. In places like Death Valley and Joshua Tree, restrooms were locked, but campgrounds might still be accessible. Yeah. So people resorted to, well, using the landscape. It became appalling. At Sequoia and Kings Canyon, the trash buildup and sanitation problems got so bad that even though the administration wanted parks open, the park managers there had to close sections later in the shutdown simply because they were becoming unsafe and unsanitary.
In Joshua Tree, I remember hearing about damage there.
Yes, Joshua Tree was hit particularly hard. People drove off-road. But also, tragically, some of the iconic ancient Joshua trees themselves were damaged or destroyed. These are incredibly slow-growing, protected plants. That kind of damage is irreversible in human lifetimes.
It must have been absolutely heartbreaking for the park staff, the rangers, whose job it is to protect these places, to be furloughed, and just watch this happen.
It was deeply demoralizing. I read an account from a young ranger, let's call him Alex, working at Joshua Tree. He was furloughed, sitting at home watching social media feeds blow up with pictures and reports of people damaging the park he was sworn to protect. Seeing illegal trails being cut, fragile desert ecosystems trampled, he described feeling completely powerless, watching his home being actively destroyed while he was legally barred from intervening. It's an incredibly painful position to be in.
And this is all happening to a National Park Service that was already struggling before any shutdown, right? This isn't hitting a perfectly healthy system. This feels like kicking something that's already down.
That's exactly right. The NPS was already facing significant challenges. They had lost something like over 25% of their permanent staff, even before this crisis. And they're facing a massive deferred maintenance backlog, over $23 billion needed for repairs across the country.
$23 billion.
Wow. Yeah. So a shutdown comes along and furloughs nearly 9,300 NPS employees. That's about 2/3 of their workforce. All the essential work, maintenance, monitoring endangered species, managing invasive plants, planning it just stops, making that backlog even worse.
So the damage isn't just the immediate vandalism people see, it's the stopping of all that crucial ongoing conservation work.
Precisely. Critical data gets lost, invasive species get a stronger foothold, needed repairs don't happen, and of course the economic hit to the local communities is immediate and severe. October is peak season for many parks. Estimates suggest gateway towns lose up to $80 million in visitor spending per day when parks are effectively closed or unusable.
Okay, so we've talked about the immediate chaos, the unpaid workers, the stalled research, the damaged parks. That's what makes the headlines. But there are deeper, longer-lasting costs, right? The hidden damage that doesn't just disappear when the government reopens.
Yeah, this feels important. The idea that being furloughed, being treated like a political pawn, does real psychological damage to the workforce. Yeah. How do we even measure something like eroded morale? It's actually measurable, surprisingly. Researchers have tried to quantify that morale shock. The estimates suggest that the impact of being furloughed, being told you're non-essential and sent home without pay, is comparable to experiencing about a 10% permanent cut in your salary in terms of its negative effect on motivation, commitment, job satisfaction.
A 10% pay cut equivalent just from the psychological impact.
Wow. And that shock directly leads to what experts call brain drain. It fundamentally changes the workforce composition in ways that weaken the government long-term.
What does that brain drain look like? Who leaves?
The data shows that federal employees who've been through a furlough are significantly more likely, about 31% more likely to quit their jobs within a year after the shutdown ends.
31% more likely to quit. And is it random who leaves, or is it specific types of employees?
It's definitely not random. The exodus hits the government's human capital the hardest. It tends to be the younger, highly educated professionals, the ones with strong skills that are valuable in the private sector who are most likely to leave. They look at the instability and think, I can do better elsewhere.
So the government loses its rising stars, its future leaders. What about experienced staff?
At the other end, you see experienced older workers, maybe those close to retirement anyway, the ones with deep institutional knowledge. They often see a shutdown as the last straw. It pushes them into early retirement. So the government is bleeding talent and experience from both ends. It's a systematic degradation of its own capacity.
You sometimes hear arguments politically that maybe shutdowns are a way to shrink government, force efficiency, but this sounds like the exact opposite. It drives out the best people and leaves agencies weaker.
That's precisely what the evidence indicates. The idea that shutdowns somehow make government leaner or more efficient is just not supported by the data. In fact, agencies that suffer high furlough rates demonstrably perform worse afterward, especially in complex, skill-intensive areas.
Like what kind of areas?
We see measurable drops in performance for things like legal enforcement actions, patent processing at the Patent and Trademark Office, complex regulatory analysis. When you lose experienced staff, that expertise is gone. Even basic administrative functions suffer. Accounting departments in agencies hit hard by furloughs tend to make significantly more errors in payments afterward.
More errors in payments. Does that actually add up to real money?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It adds up to billions. The scale of federal payments is enormous. So even a tiny increase in the error rate, say inaccurate payments go up by just 1%, that translates directly into billions of dollars of taxpayer money lost, misdirected, or wasted that you never get back. These are real, long-term financial consequences.
Okay, so the government loses talent, performance drops, errors increase, but the work still needs to get done, presumably. How do agencies fill those gaps left by the people who quit or retire early?
And that leads to the final kind of brutal irony here. To plug the holes left by the brain drain, agencies become much more reliant on expensive temporary staffing firms and private contractors.
So they end up paying more to replace the people they just lost.
Often, yes. Studies following the 2013 shutdown found that the agencies most affected by furloughs ended up spending roughly $1 billion more on contractors in the following 2 years than the government had saved in payroll costs during the shutdown itself.
Wait, so the short-term savings from not paying salaries during the shutdown were completely wiped out, and then some by the later costs of hiring contractors.
Exactly. The political theater of a shutdown ends up being incredibly inefficient financially. You replace experienced civil servants who have institutional knowledge with temporary contractors who are often more expensive per hour, less familiar with the agency's work, and require more oversight. So the long-term costs higher turnover, the expense of replacing labor, the measurable drop in productivity, the billions lost through errors and inefficiency. They absolutely dwarf any supposed short-term savings. The government pays more later for less effective services. So when we pull all these threads together, the picture that emerges is pretty stark. A government shutdown isn't just a temporary blip or an inconvenience.
No, it's clearly a systemic shock. It puts national safety at risk immediately. The air traffic controllers stressed about their mortgage, the blind spots appearing in food safety, the loss of irreplaceable disease research.
And it causes lasting, measurable harm that costs taxpayers long after the politicians make a deal. The environmental damage in parks those Joshua trees aren't growing back quickly. The pollution lingers. And the government's own ability to function effectively is eroded from the inside out.
It's striking that the main fix is back pay. But as you said, money can't undo lost research like Lena's. It can't undamage a fragile ecosystem. And it certainly can't instantly restore the morale, trust, and expertise lost from the workforce.
Exactly. The recurring trauma of shutdowns systematically degrades the government's capacity. It makes it less efficient, less effective, and ultimately more expensive to run, generating billions in hidden costs through turnover and inefficiency that far outweigh any temporary payroll savings.